You know what? Today seems like a perfect day to put together a VR6 engine. As we move forward on our Turbo R32 project, we need to finish getting our engine put back together. Now, I've already built the bottom end of it, which you could check the video out that we did on that. So my plan for today is to get essentially the long block assembled, which is cylinder head, engine timed, and as many accessories as it makes sense to put on right now. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean off our engine block surface where our head gasket's going to go. We want to make sure this surface is clean and dry. I also went ahead and re-lubricated all the cylinders with a little bit of clean engine oil. Now this step may be a little bit of overkill, but I like to take some acetone and just wipe down our mating surface, make sure that we don't have any leftover yuck. You also want to make sure if there is any dirt or debris or anything down in the cylinders, go ahead and get it out now. There's probably not going to be a better opportunity to get this stuff cleaned other than right now. Next up, we have to get our head gasket put on. Now, for this application, we actually have two head gaskets. We have one that's going to go right here on the block. Then we're going to put our head gasket spacer on. Then we have a head gasket that goes on top of that. I've also done the method of drilling out the rivets and stacking the head gasket like that. That way works pretty good too, but for the HPA setup, they do give you two head gaskets. We also have these extended alignment dowels that we need to install, so we're just gonna go ahead and do that first. These are gonna help us get not only our head gasket and spacer lined up, to make sure that when we set the cylinder head down, it's oriented properly. Okay, now that our alignment dowels are installed, we can do our first head gasket. Now, important note on a head gasket, even though most of the time it's incredibly hard, if not impossible, to put these on backwards or upside down, it can happen. So be super careful when you're putting on your head gasket. On a VR6 like this, it's almost impossible to get it on there, but I'm sure some folks have found a way to do it wrong. So with our block surface clean, we'll go ahead and lay our gasket down just like that. Now, throughout the rest of the process, we're gonna need to take extra care of this section right here because we don't want to bend this part of the gasket down. Our timing covers are gonna go here, and we don't want to cause a leak in this area. Before we put our head gasket spacer on, we gotta do a couple of things. You'll notice on the head gasket, right where the block would meet the timing cover, there's a hole in the front and at the back. We actually have to fill those holes in with silicone, and we're gonna need to do that for each layer of our head gasket head spacer setup. Once you have your head gasket spacer clean, it is time to set it into place. Just like that. We'll go ahead and wipe down, even though I already cleaned our top surface, we'll go ahead and wipe it down again. Go ahead and take our silicone again, right in these spots right here, where our gasket is gonna overhang. With our head gasket spacer on and our sealant on and our head gasket spacer is of course already clean, we can put on our second head gasket. 2 for the price of 2. There we go. Wow, look at that. It's huge. All right. Now you'll notice our dowels stick up just past where our head gasket and spacer are. It's gonna help us get our cylinder head lined up properly. Next up, we're gonna get our cylinder head and lay it down into place. You wanna be very careful not to scratch up the gasket. Ta-da! We are going to properly torque our cylinder head to our engine block. I'm going back with the factory head bolts. I know a lot of you are like, but Charles, you should be using the ARP or high performance bolts or studs. Your cylinder head's gonna explode right off the engine. Well, I hope that doesn't happen. However, in talking with HPA, a lot of what they recommend on VR6s in particular is using the factory stuff. So, you know what? This is either gonna be right or it's gonna be wrong. I hope we never find out and the engine's just fine, but if the head blows off the engine, you guys can tell me, I told you so. Now this engine has 2 different length head bolts. The bolts in the middle are longer than the ones on the outside. And we've already went through and cleaned out and thread chased the threads in the block, so we can just drop these bolts right in. Now, our first run is just going to be snugging the bolts up. I have my little drill here turned all the way down, so we shouldn't really do anything but get them a little bit more than hand tight. For our first run of torquing our head bolts, we are going to be torquing them to 30 Newton meters or roughly 22 pound-feet. We're going to make sure we follow our proper sequence, which is starting in the middle and working our way out. Next, we're going to do that same order at 50 Newton meters or roughly 37 pound-feet of torque. Next up, we need to tighten all of the bolts 90 degrees. Now, I went ahead and marked a mark at 12 o'clock on all of our bolts as I'm looking at them. So what we'll do is we'll just do a quarter of a turn so that all the little paint marks face 3 o'clock. We'll come back one more time, do another quarter turn, and go to they all face 6 o'clock or pointing back towards me. Luckily with torque to yield bolts that are say 90 or 180 degrees, it's super easy to just mark them and eyeball them. If you have a weird degree you need to turn it to, it's probably best to use a torque angle gauge. Now, a lot of you guys are probably wondering, Charles, why are you going with a head gasket spacer instead of doing low compression pistons? Why are you going with factory hardware instead of upgrading everything? Those are all incredibly good questions, and after some very long, in-depth conversations with HPA, I learned a lot about the VR6 engine specifically and what happens when you start modifying it. See, unlike a lot of other engines, even in the VW world, the VR6 engine itself is incredibly well built. So in many cases, if we did pistons that lowered compression, we'd actually be weakening the piston. So instead of weakening the piston and risking that damage, we can install a head gasket spacer and achieve the compression drop while maintaining those really high quality factory parts. HPA's probably built more turbo VR6s than just about anybody, and they've done a lot of R&D showing that unless you're building insane horsepower, 700-800 plus, the factory hardware, minus the connecting rod bolts, actually holds up incredibly well. Now, on this particular build, I've learned a lot about the aftermarket and how it works. And what I've found, if you have 10 companies that all do something similar, or in this case, say, turbocharged VR6s, they're all gonna have a different way of doing many of the things. And you know what? They might actually all be right. Their way might work perfectly each and every time. It seems like you could do everything perfect and have a failure, or you could slap it together in full send and have nothing ever go wrong. So what I'm really trying to do here is just put the best parts on that we can reasonably afford and do the best job installing that I possibly can. It's one of those things where I actually hope we never find out whether this was right or wrong, because that means we didn't have any failure. Okay, we got our cylinder head on. Now, before we can do anything on the backside timing, we have to put on our front timing cover, mostly because that is where our timing mark is for the crankshaft. Now, we could actually do this without, but I like to always use the front cover and the back side of the crankshaft to confirm timing. Now, you'll also notice that when I put this on, there's this big old gap right here. That's because there is a seal that needs to go there. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put this cover on first, then I'm gonna put the seal on. Also, if you are running the ARP studs, like I was going to, you need to trim out just a little bit of the cover. You can see I just took a Dremel and ground it down a little bit. Otherwise, that stud or the nut for the stud is gonna hit this cover and the cover won't go on square. So if you're running that, you need to trim off a little bit with a Dremel. Now, before we put this on, we gotta put our sealant on it so that it doesn't leak. So we're just gonna put a small bead of our sealant around the outer edge. And remember, this is not a case where more is always better. There is a point where just too much of this stuff is not ideal. Once we have our bead of sealant, we are going to take our cover piece, get it aligned on the dowels, slide it into place, and I actually have some new hardware we're going to install. I'm going to be doing these, snugging these down even and going across the center of it. Make sure that we get a good even snug-a-do on it. It's also important to make sure you install this within about 5 minutes of putting that sealant on there. Otherwise, the sealant starts to harden and it may not seal properly. Now, when it comes to the seal for the crankshaft on this side, there's actually two different styles of seal. The earlier revisions were a seal that looked very similar to this, but on the inside of it, there was a spring that went around it. Those work really well for sealing. But then they moved to this style of seal, which is a PTFE seal. These install two different ways, so you need to make sure you're paying attention to which style seal that you have. odds are if you get it from the dealer at this point, you're gonna get one of these PTFE seals. The one with the spring, normally what I would do is I would oil up the crankshaft, and I would take it, and I would just slide it right on, and it would go right in, no problem, and it would be all kinds of happy. The PTFE ones like this, you need to install them dry. So there's a couple of things we wanna make sure we're doing. One, of course, we wanna make sure this is clean, this is dry, both on the crankshaft and on the cover. Make sure it's clean and dry on the cover before you put the cover on, because it's gonna be much easier to get it that way. Also, we wanna try and work this inner part of the seal open a little bit. You can see the sealing flange of the seal kind of angles in, and if we install it on the crankshaft, it's gonna try and push this lip out instead of sealing on the crankshaft. So we need to kind of open the seal up a little bit. A couple of ways you can do that. One, if you take your finger and just kind of do this, it'll sort of slightly stretch that seal out. We don't need much. There are also special tools that you're actually supposed to use, little cones similar to this, that when you put on the end of a crankshaft or a camshaft, it'll help the seal slide in. I don't have the one for the crankshaft. This is actually one that came in a seal for a cam for like a BPY or something like that. But we can still use it a bit to stretch out our seal. Also, if you have a clean socket of the appropriate size, you can use that and stretch the seal that way. We also want to make sure that we don't catch it on the edge right here. That's probably my biggest concern. So take your time, get that seal a little warm, open up the PTFE part of the seal. Once you get it started, then it becomes quite a bit easier to install. Grab a socket that fits over whatever the component that it is, so in this case our crankshaft nose, and just gently tap it in. Try and make sure you're getting it in evenly so that you don't tweak the seal. And there we go. Now we got our front crank all set up. We can go ahead and put our pulley on. I'm not gonna torque this down or anything like that, because we're gonna, one, have to replace the bolt, and two, I think I'm gonna put one of those fluid damper things on it. Now this will make turning our crankshaft quite a bit easier, and we can double check our timing marks. Next up, we need to get our timing chains installed. Now, I've done 2 super in-depth timing chain videos, so I'm gonna be pretty brief on this installation. First up, we're gonna install our intermediate shaft. This is also the shaft that drives our oil pump. Next, a new lower timing chain guide, then our intermediate gears. These are not a must replace, but if you have high miles and you're doing timing chains, it's definitely worth an evaluation. For this one, I'm doing 2 new gears. Then we're gonna make sure our crankshaft is set to TDC. We'll go ahead and put the chain on, and then install the new lower timing chain tensioner. Next up, we're going to install our lash adjusters and rocker arms for our camshafts. Not only am I lubricating them before reinstalling them, but I'm putting them back in exactly where they came from. Now we can lube the lower bearing of the camshaft and make sure that the rockers are lubricated as well. There is also something else we need to pay extra close attention to. This is the side of the camshaft where our variator goes. There are 3 rings on the end of the camshaft. These are oil control rings. You need to make sure that the gap in them, the gap, like you can see it right there, they're set 120 degrees apart, just like we did with our piston rings. These are for oil flow. We want to make sure we don't just have them straight lined up. Once we got that done, we'll go ahead and clean our camshafts and set them into place. Now we can lubricate and set our cam caps into place, and then get the nuts started. I also like to set the camshaft in place as close to TDC as possible. This means we just have less work when we're going to set our upper timing chain. Also worth noting on this one with a head spacer, when we installed that head spacer, we actually turned this into a non-interference engine. So we really don't have to worry about rotating something around and valves hitting pistons. All right, let's get our intake cam torqued down. Now, we need to make sure we're following the repair manual on this, and the way that we tighten these down is we tighten down cap 5 and 9 to 5 Newton meters plus 1/8 of a turn or 45 degrees. So we're gonna just kind of walk this down evenly as we can. You wanna also make sure that your rockers are all properly placed, because if they're not properly placed now, you're probably not gonna get it to happen with the camshaft in. I'm just snugging these down a little bit at a time. Really, the first 2 are the ones that this is the most important. Okay, so we will tighten these to 5 Newton meters, which is not very tight, plus 1/8 of a turn or 45 degrees. A little trickier than 90, but still not too bad to eyeball. 45, 45, 45, 45. We're gonna do that same thing for caps 1 and 13, which are the end ones. Then we do number 7, and I really can't stress this enough, guys. If you're doing stuff like this, you really need to make sure you have the repair manual so you can double check all these torque specs. Whether it's this engine or something else, follow the repair manual on this stuff. This is stuff you wanna make sure you get right. And then we do the same thing for number 3 and number 11, which should go pretty smooth. Our camshaft's basically tightened down at this point. Once you have your cams all torqued down properly, we're gonna get our timing plate and we're gonna set these babies to TDC, which should just be a little bump of an adjustment like that. Next, we can move to doing our upper timing chain. First, we're gonna be installing our cam adjuster bridge. A very critical step here, make sure you lubricate that bridge. Otherwise, you run the risk of breaking those oil control rings or even damaging the camshaft. I'm also gonna be installing new hardware for this bridge. Next, we'll do our outer intermediate gear, then our tensioner timing chain guide, and then our front timing chain guide. After that, we can install our intake cam gear. Remember, if you're looking for a step-by-step how-to on all this stuff, be sure to check out those other 2 videos, both with and without head gasket spacers. This is not a hard engine to time, but there's a couple of little things that you really want to make sure you know and you pay attention to. Then we can put our timing chain on. After that, we can put our exhaust cam gear on. And I'm only installing these cam variator or cam gear bolts hand tight. Make sure when you do that though, all of the slack in the chain is on the timing chain tensioner side. If you have the slack anywhere else on that circuit other than where the timing chain tensioner is on the back side of the engine, you are not going to get your engine timed right. After that, I like to take a zip tie and zip tie it around the 2 timing chain guides. This is going to simulate having a timing chain tensioner installed and keep our chain where it's supposed to be. Then we're going to rotate the engine around 2 full revolutions of the crankshaft. This will be 1 complete engine cycle. Then we're going to recheck our crank timing, we'll recheck our cam timing, and we'll check our camshaft timing by making sure that the plate fits when we're done. Next, we're going to move to our timing covers. Now for our lower timing cover, we have to put our rear main seal on, which is this guy. It's pretty much exactly the same kind of seal as our front crank seal, but it's obviously quite a bit bigger, and we have the little retainer. If you have something that will go all the way around this, kind of like we did from the front, I like to put this on after the cover's on, but I don't have something that big, so we are going to get it installed with the cover off. This is nice too, because like this is a nice flat piece, so it's actually pretty easy to do. I'll take a block of wood or something that's about as wide as the seal. I will set it on there with a towel, and I'll just gently tap it down as evenly as possible. There we go, nice and flush with our cover. Once you have your seal in, go ahead and flip your cover over. We're gonna put a thin bead of sealant around each side of our lower cover. You don't need a lot here. You want to make sure you don't do across the bottom here. There's no need to, nothing goes right here. And then the very bottom piece, don't do that either. We'll do that when we do our oil pan. Before we deal with our lower timing cover, we want to make sure that the mating surface where we're going to mount it is nice and clean, including our head gasket. Make sure there's no oil or yuck inside of there. Now there's kind of 2 schools of thought when it comes to sealant on the head gasket. One, there's already like a little bead of sealant on the head gasket, so you don't need to. 2, you should put sealant on it because that'll help seal it better. I've seen both ways work, I've seen both ways leak. Now where you for sure want to make sure you put sealant is up in the corners here of the bottom and the top of the head gasket. Now this next part can be kind of tricky because we have sealant all over our cover. So we're gonna do just like we did with that front crank seal. Gonna run our finger around the seal. The seal gets installed dry as well. And here we go. Pull up on our head gasket a little. All right, we're kind of lined up at the top. We're kind of lined up at the bottom. Pull our tool out. Just gently make sure our seal is not rolled. And once you make sure your seal's not like tweaked or anything like that, you can grab a mallet and just tap it gently the rest of the way home. You shouldn't really have far to go though. I'm using plain bolts down at the bottom, and I'm using our nice, cool, Zealous Manufacturing beauty washers up at the top. You want to take care not to like try and pull the cover in all the way with these bolts. Now what's cool is I have new bolts for almost all of the bottom of the lower cover, except one. So I'm gonna have to reuse one, which I'm not super thrilled with, but I was one short, so that's what's gonna happen. For the one I'm reusing though, let's get some thread locker on it. That way it is also micro encapsulated, just like the other replacement ones. That's a fancy word for having thread locker on it. Next up, we are gonna get our upper cover installed. Now, before you just go slapping this upper cover on, there's a couple things you gotta pay extra close attention to. We have an O-ring that goes right here on the back side of the cover. This is for oil pressure to our tensioner. We also have an O-ring that basically goes where our coolant flange bolts onto on the other side. So you gotta make sure you have that as well. Actually, I'm put back a day because I didn't have that seal. Also, the easy ones are gonna be these two up on the front here for our cam adjuster solenoids. These guys should pop right in pretty easily. And we'll make sure we lubricate these seals before we put our cover on. That'll help our cover go on a bit easier. You also want to make sure that all of your mating surfaces that we're about to put some sealant on are nice and clean. Next up, we are going to get our two new seals in. This one is for coolant. That guy just drops right in there. And then we have a little O-ring for oil. That guy drops in right there. Next up, we need to get our sealant. So I'm going to do the back first, then I'm going to do the bottom, then we're going to drop our cover right on. Before you get that cover on, you want to make sure all your surfaces back here are clean, including the head gasket. Take a little bit of dielectric grease, lubricate our adjuster solenoids so those seals slide on nice and easy. I'm also going to have to cut my zip tie. We can get our cover and hopefully slip it right on. You want to make sure this cover is seated all the way. We'll get all of our new hardware started. Sometimes getting these bottom bolts lined up can be a little tricky. The end of that chapter. And we'll probably clean these fingerprints off of here too. Next up, we have to get our tensioner taken care of. Now, if you're not doing a big turbo setup or a turbo setup that's using this style of line to feed oil to the turbocharger, you probably can skip this step and just run the tensioner in. However, because this little spacer goes like this into our tensioner and supplies oil to our turbocharger, we need to take this shaft out and put this extended one in.
Okay, so here is where this job kind of went sideways on me. When I ordered the timing kit, it came with a timing chain tensioner that was not a factory part. Generally, this isn't a huge deal. However, in this case, it ended up being a huge deal. What I didn't realize was the tensioner that I got was actually a different design than the factory tensioner. And unfortunately, that means the extended plunger wouldn't fit. But I didn't realize that at first, so I ended up fighting it and fighting it and fighting it and fighting it. It turns out that the extended plunger was actually 0.5 millimeter bigger than the plunger in this timing chain tensioner. I actually ended up having to cut that tensioner apart and then threw it in the trash. So I ended up buying a new OEM timing chain tensioner. This one actually came apart super simple, but wasn't quite so happy going back together. There's a clip that lives at the bottom of this plunger, and it keeps it from popping out, especially while it's like in transport or out of the engine. Once it's in the engine, this plunger can't come out, and if it does, you got way bigger problems, so that is of very little concern. Well, the recess of the extended plunger where the clip would ride is actually 0.5 millimeter bigger than the factory one, and I think what was happening is this wouldn't allow the clip to compress enough to fit into the tensioner body. So I spent way more time than I ever planned on with this timing chain tensioner. Odds are I'm gonna end up just deleting that clip altogether. Like I said, once it's installed in the engine, it can't come apart. But as of right this second, I haven't done anything. I needed a minute to walk away. Otherwise, I would probably end up having to buy a third tensioner.
All right, now it is time to install one of, so far anyway, my favorite parts of this car, the purple powder-coated accessory bracket. You're looking at this thing, you're like, man, Charles, that thing looks so awesome, and I agree with you, and then there's a handful of you that have been burned by what I'm about to talk about, and you're like, dude, don't forget to make sure that you clean the powder coat off of the mounting points. This accessory bracket acts as a ground for the alternator, which means if we don't clean the powder coat off of all the mounting points and where the alternator mounts to, which is up here at the top, we will have no ground for our alternator. So our alternator sits like this. We have to also clean the powder off of that mounting surface as well, which kind of stinks because it would be awesome if we didn't have to like crack the powder, but we need to because we need to have a proper ground. I also am thinking I may end up having to crack the powder right here. This is actually a little sleeve that slides back and forth for our power steering pump. See if we can use this little whiz wheel here. This is gonna need to be all the way down to bare metal on all the mounting points. Here's kind of what our cover is gonna look like. And the sad part is, once this engine's together, you'll see like the top corner right here, and that's pretty much it. I gotta say, that looks pretty awesome. Now, you may remember way back, we actually had a brand new alternator in the R32 when I bought it, but unfortunately, it's seized. So I'm not gonna be putting this one in, but just for mock-up's sake, that is roughly what it's gonna look like. I actually don't even know if this is the right alternator. This is the one that came out of it. It looks kind of bad, but it actually did work. The only problem is this one-way clutch, the Sprag clutch here was bad, so we'll have to take this apart, clean it up, and then at least replace the clutch on that pulley there, which is not a big deal. Next up, we're gonna install our thermostat housing and our water transfer tube that we all lovingly call the crack pipe. We actually need to assemble our thermostat housing a little bit first, which means dropping our thermostat in, lubricating and dropping our seal on, like that. This is a thermostat housing from Eurowise, a thermostat housing that I have used many different times on many different VR6s. Put our thermostat cover on, and we're using the same decorative hardware that we've been using, but because our housing is purple, I'm gonna use the black beauty washers. And of course, like I've probably said 100 times, I'll link all this stuff up for you guys if you wanna check out exactly what I'm using here. Now, one thing I'm not gonna do is I'm not gonna put our coolant temperature sensor and our plug in just yet. I'm gonna get new ones because these are not something you really wanna reuse, and they're cheap enough that it makes it worth just getting new ones. What we do need to do though, is we do need to install our seal here. We'll also go ahead and lubricate this opening here. This is where our crack pipe slides into. We got to start with putting our water pipe in. I'm going to lubricate this up. When we had the block all out and apart and everything, I cleaned up this port as well as I could. It's kind of rusted in there, but I think it should still be fine to seal our water pipe. We'll lubricate our seal up nice and good. Probably among the worst place to have a coolant leak once you get the car back together. Then what we can do is put our thermostat housing on. This has 3 bolts that hold it on, 2 pretty long ones, and then 1 little shorty at the back. And we also need to get our crack pipe in there. Pretty much the thing that holds this crack pipe or water pipe in is just these bolts here for the thermostat housing. Push it the rest of the way into the block and hold it in place. We're also using the little black beauty washers so that it's not a mismatched purple on purple. Even though the purple of the powder coated stuff and the beauty washers I'm using on like the timing cover are really close, they don't match enough that I really want to use purple on purple. Push it all the way up to the timing cover by hand and then snug it down. And we can still rotate our water pipe when we're ready to put our lines and stuff on. Sticking with the cooling system, let's go ahead and get our water pump installed. This water pump on this engine is driven by the serpentine belt, and I did go ahead and get a new water pump. This pump actually only goes on one way, which is kind of awesome. Now, the bolts that hold this water pump in, I actually don't love. They're triple squares, and they're pretty shallow with how far in the triple square socket or whatever you're using goes, but they also have to be conical like this in order to fit into the water pump. So I'm pretty sure when I took this apart, I had to pound the socket in order to get it to seat fully so that the bolts came out. While we're here, let's go ahead and put our pulley on. I actually did a little bit of light rehab on this pulley, cleaned it up a bit and painted it just with black epoxy paint so that it looks fresh. And I also have beauty washers for this one. Next up, we are going to put on our oil filter housing. This has 2 seals at the back side of it that we're going to replace and is held in with 3 bolts. I'm actually going to get a different oil cooler than the one we had on. I did some research and it seems that the Torag V6 oil cooler bolts right up to this housing and it's a little bit bigger. So we're going to try that first before we try the next step, which would be an external oil cooler. Hopefully we can get away with just one that's a little bit bigger. Now you're probably wondering, Charles, why are you putting this old, ugly, not powder coated or pretty new piece back on your engine? And that, my friends, is a great question because by no means on this project are we pinching pennies. However, we are kind of pinching dollars. So it's like $165 for a new one of these. It would also cost me to have it media blasted and then powder coated. And this is a part that the only thing you'll ever see once this is back together is like this much with the oil filter in it. Plus we have to get a new oil filter cap, the piece that actually screws into the bottom here, because the one that was on there was all messed up. So this is a part, believe me, I would love to replace it or whatever. I just don't think it's worth the time and the money. Next, we'll go ahead and put our power steering pump in. Just like with the oil filter housing, I'm installing the old pump without a ton of rehab. And there's 2 main reasons. You're really not gonna see this pump because it's gonna be buried up underneath. Also, there was some seepage around the seal at the back of the pump. Now I could jump in and rebuild it right away. However, I kinda wanna see where it's at once we get the car back up and running. If this is a part that I gotta rebuild or replace after the car's together, it's really not that big of a deal. We'll have plenty of room to access it. And much like the water pump, I did some light rehab on the power steering pulley. I also have some fancy pants hardware that we're gonna use for this one. Now for the exhaust, I actually got all new exhaust studs. That way we didn't have to worry about any sadness from our old high mile salt belt car. I'm gonna be installing these using the 2-nut method, which is we install 2 nuts on the stud, we tighten them together, and then we use the outside nut to tighten the stud and lock it into place. So we tighten these guys together. We can actually probably run this in by hand a bit, and then we can just go ahead and snug it down. Then we loosen the nuts and do it again 13 more times. Don't worry, I won't bore you with having to watch all of these. All right, with all of our studs in, let's do something that I am super excited about and test fit this exhaust manifold. Now I'm not gonna leave it on, we're just gonna test fit it. I think I might actually end up getting this hot jet coated. I've never had anything hot jet coated and you guys ask me about it somewhat frequently, so I figure this is a good opportunity to get that done. Well, that's pretty anticlimactic, so let's do something even better and see what our engine looks like with our valve cover on. Oh man, that looks so good. So I'm also not going to fully mount the valve cover up for 2 reasons. One, we still need to get all the oil stuff in, the pump and the pan. I need to modify the pan in order to have our oil return line go into it. After that, we'll prime the oil system to fully bring oil up to the top end of the engine. And I like to see that happen, so I'm not gonna put the valve cover on. This is the spot we're gonna gain access to that, so we'll take all this stuff back off. I think we're gonna go ahead and test fit our turbocharger. This may not be the exact setup that we use, but I did have 4 studs that are the right thread pitch for this turbo setup. Also, this kit doesn't use a gasket here. It's probably okay, but man, that makes me really uneasy, so I'm probably gonna go ahead and get a gasket for this, just like we did on the Mark III. Here we go, moment of truth. Ugh, for this bad boy. Oh man, I'm so excited. Let's get a nut on here. Go on, go on. Oh man, the fitment, I'll show you guys in a second. The fitment from turbocharger to block is so tight. Oh man, it sits so low in the engine bay. Why am I talking? Let me show you. All right, here we go. Look at this bad boy. Holy smokes. Now, keep in mind, we have no transmission or anything on this thing. Look at that bad boy. Holy cow. That looks so good. Oh my God. Check this out. Down the turbo hole. Look at how tight that fitment is right there. It's so tight, but man, oh, it looks so good. Let's just take a quick tour of the whole engine. So this is going to be the side that the transmission bolts up to. We'll put the clutch on in another video. Top side, man, look at that valve cover. Oh, so it looks like there's a ton of purple on this engine right now, but you're not going to see the majority of it. Our manifold's going to cover most of the valve cover. You'll only see like the top little bit of this. You'll hardly see anything over on this side, but it looks so good on the stand. And the best part, that spoolie boy right there, just begging for boost. I'm also looking at this, and it is going to be a super tight fit in this engine compartment. Holy smokes. Okay, clearly, I appreciate you guys sticking around and seeing this full, mostly completed engine setup, and I am so excited about this. I mean, this is amazing. So this is a BorgWarner EFR 8474 Turbo. If you're interested, this is the HPA kit that we got a couple months ago. So I've been waiting for this moment to see this for several months. And for those of you guys that have been sticking around this whole time through this whole project, I hope you're as excited as I am, or even if you're like 10% as excited as I am, that's enough for me. So this is awesome. I'm gonna pull this stuff back off and put it away because we're not ready for that kind of stuff. We still got to get like transmission and all that bolted up before we worry about the turbocharger. But boy, just to see it on here and see the engine and see the valve cover on, it's so awesome, and I'm so excited. All right, well, that's enough talking. We got more work to do. We got a clutch on. We got to get our transmission put on. We got our coolant stuff that we got to get put on. I got still a bunch more parts on order that we're waiting for. We still need paint on the car. I feel like it's going to be 100 years before we're done. But this step here, for me anyway, is super huge, super motivating. I hope you guys are excited. I'm flying high right now because this is so, so awesome. With that, I'm out. Have an awesome day, and I'll talk to you guys again next time. Bye-bye.